kind of the curveball that was always thrown at us is they'd call it the Hummer dance. You know, the E-2's kind of nickname around the ship was the Hummer, and they would have us come down, and now Hornet bolters doesn't catch the wire, so they would tell us to spin, do a 360 because they want us to come down last because of how big we are, right?
Yeah.
So they don't have the deck space physically for us until everybody else lands most of the times.
Let's E-2. So I don't know much about the E-2. You're gonna tell me a little bit about the E-2, what the mission is,
Sure.
what your journey in that look like.
Yeah, so it's essentially a tiny AWACS, basically.
Yeah.
So 5 people in it, 2 pilots, 3 NFOs in the back. Essentially does the job of the AWACS. Various things. When it was first designed way back in the day, it was designed as a Russian bear finder. That was its sole purpose, was to find Russian bears coming at the aircraft carrier. And long range radar, all that, did a pretty good job at it. As technology's evolved, there's a lot more technology in it now, as far as the way it connects the whole carrier battle group and airplanes and submarines and ships and everything. It really has kind of evolved in that role, which is pretty impressive. It's been in every major conflict. We flew over Iraq, we flew over Afghanistan. It's been everywhere since. It's evolving even more now with the E-2D, which I never flew. But the E-2D has in-flight refueling, which, as somebody who's flown an E-2 and has also in-flight refueled, I give a lot of credit to the pilots who fly the E-2 that in-flight refuel, because that I can't believe is an easy thing to do, just with the P factor and the visibility of that cockpit. But that's going to give it more mission time, more options. One of the things and it comes out in the book at one point, is, every mission we took off on the ship, we had X amount of fuel, and that's it. And you didn't have a choice. We were operating blue water operations, meaning there's no divert field. Your only place to land is that carrier, period. And you have X amount of gas. And one of my buddies who flew Hornets, when I did the transition, he told me, he said, well, the thing about a Hornet pilot around the ship is you're either really good at landing on the ship or you're really good at tanking. One or the other. That's it. And I chose that I wanted to be good at landing on the ship because I didn't enjoy tanking as much. But in the E-2, it's just, there was no option. So, the option long term, if you couldn't get aboard, would be either a bailout or a barricade, which either one is not a good situation. So it's a big airplane. It's 80-foot wingspan on an 85-foot landing area. So that's constantly moving to your right as you come down, since the ship with the angled deck. 4 tails, 3 rudders. So that should tell you there's a lot of weird things about the way the plane flies. But, as far as the mission goes, probably one of the most critical support aircraft on the ship. A good E-2 crew. And what I mean by that is really the back end guys and girls, not the pilots. We had to do our job. We had to keep the plane physically on its mission profile, but and then deal with whatever broke and whatever things we were dealing with. But it was really the guys and girls in the back that were kind of the unsung heroes. If you had a good group up there, the fighter pilots loved it because the situational awareness was huge. If you had a bad crew, it was almost worthless to have them, and they'd rather just stop talking on the radio and let the fighter pilots do their job. So it was also critical, in Afghanistan with the ground war in Iraq. Coordination between fighter assets and the people on the ground was huge. So there was a lot of different roles that I don't think the original creators of the E-2 ever thought were out there. So it's kind of interesting. It's the first one off the deck and the last one to come back, so nobody ever knows what it's really going out and doing. But some of the tightest squadrons and maintenance and everything, just because they knew that role was important, and you got to get them airborne. So
the only thing I've latched onto in this whole thing is the concept, the fact that you can't tank, or E-2D can, right? But that's a concept. Blue water ops, there's always a Hornet sitting on deck as a tanker or a launch, whatever in the recovery window, right? For guys who can't get aboard. But the fact that you got to love the one you're with.
That's it. That's it. You got your gas when you start, and that's the gas you're going to come back with. And we as pilots were really good at fuel ladders and setting the right fuels and contingency plans and idle descents. And, you know, and ultimately kind of the curveball that was always thrown at us is they'd call it the Hummer dance. You know, the E2's kind of nickname around the ship was the Hummer. And they would have us come down and, you know, now a Hornet bolters doesn't catch the wire. So they would tell us to spin, you know, do a 360 because they want us to come down last because of how big we are, right?
Yeah.
So they don't have the deck space physically for us until everybody else lands most of the time. So, you know, you would do all these best calculations to have, you know, the maximum amount of fuel you want to have. But at the end of the day, you know, it's ultimately, you had to have a little for mom and dad every time, you know, because you knew something was going to happen. But yeah, it was, you know, it was an interesting profile in that sense. You kind of learn to live with it and just accept it. And, you know, it was one of those things that in aviation, you know, you can control. It's like being a single engine, you know, it's nerve wracking to fly a single engine aircraft because if something happens to that engine, but there was nothing you can do about it. So you learn how to live with it and you hope for the best, and it usually works itself out. So
yeah, the decision tree is really easy in a single engine airplane, right? You know, it's like go, no go.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm up the rails. I'm not. You
exactly,
know,
exactly. But it was, you know, it was interesting, and it brought some unique problems just because of that. You know, on some of our mission profiles and the way we would deploy the plane and things like that, we had to kind of think outside the box a little bit, but yeah, it didn't affect me too negatively. There's one flight that I remember that was pretty low on gas and things like that. But you do what you have to do. And we launched on an alert because two planes had a midair and they needed basically not a SAR because the pilots didn't eject, but basically rescue assets for getting tankers airborne because we were blue water ops. It wasn't even our carrier. It was another carrier, but their E2 couldn't get an E2. You know, their E2 squadron could not get a plane airborne. So they asked us to launch, and we ran to the plane and launched in like 15 minutes and got airborne and coordinated something like it turned out. They said afterwards it was like 35 tanking assets from different carriers to basically string along to send them both to Guam. Eventually, it was ridiculous, the effort, but we landed pretty low on gas on that one. So
what are the legs in a E2? You
would typically do, I mean, you could do 6 hours without a problem mission profile. Once you get above 6, it starts getting a little, your pucker factor goes up a little bit after that. You know, and again, it depends on weather and where we can loiter and are we going someplace vice just, you know, sitting on a station, things like that.
Yeah.
So, you know, when we were doing Afghanistan stuff, we would go all the way up into Afghanistan and back, and you're really tight on gas on that. You know, granted, you're over land, so if something went bad, you could always dump in somewhere. We had our divert fields. But the other problem is the E2 is not really self-sufficient, so it needs a power cart. It needs external air to start.
Yeah.
Very finicky. So the odds are if you land in some of these places, you're not going to get that thing started back up very easily. So,
you know, but the thing is, my last deployment had to go to the KOC and do my 3-week, you know, liaison tour. So you're basically representing the unit and, you know, coordinating with schedules and stuff like that. But I sit next to the Navy guy. Every Air Force guy in there was absolutely miserable, right? Because they're like out of the fight. They just want to get back into it. And you're like, this just sucks.
Yep.
Navy guy was so ecstatic. He's like, yeah, I got Wi-Fi. I got 3 beers a day. He's like,
he's like,
this is the greatest place on earth. I'm like, it's all about perspective.
It's perspective. It is. After a while, the carrier could be daunting to be on. And it's not a lot of privacy, not a lot of your own time on an aircraft carrier. So, but it's a great place to see at night when you've been airborne for 6+ hours and you find it and land on it.
Yeah.
That's where the food's at. So that's a good thing. But yeah.
So, you wrote, Treason Flight. Again, I'll throw that up there on the website and links to that. But obviously, E2 on the front of that, I assume there's some inspiration. Can you tell me a little bit about like what drove you to write?
Sure. So ironically, it started, or the idea started as I was going to write an autobiography. So my kid could read it one day, you know, because he's young and isn't going to experience much of my military career. And then I quickly realized that my military career is not very exciting. So kind of taking, not necessarily advice, but kind of inspiration from authors in the past, like Stephen Kuntz is one that comes to mind with Flight of the Intruder.
Yeah.
The whole premise of that story was basically, he was an A6 pilot. He made a fictional character, took a bunch of stories onto this fictional character of stories that actually happened, some that didn't, and wrote a book. And that's basically where this went is, there's a fictional character. Jack Owen, Rattler is his call sign, and he's an E-2 pilot on a combat deployment. He's dealing with all the stuff that everybody, I truly don't think it matters what service you're in, that deal with on deployments, time away from home.
Yeah.
Potential marriage issues, just the squadron life itself, maintenance issues, all this stuff. And that in and of itself could have been a book, but in this particular case, Rattler finds out that there's basically people above him that are kind of out for their own good and not the good of the Navy or that. So he has to make a decision on whether he's going to try to uncover this act. And it's likely going to cost him his career. It may cost him his life, lives of people around him. And that's basically the premise of the book is what do you do? When you're put up against the wall, do you make the tough decision or do you just kind of go with the flow and not stand out? So that's basically the book. And that's where it came from. So definitely a shift from what the original idea was.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting story. I tried to bring aspects of the E-2 that a lot of people don't know. I can tell you there's no other fictional book written about the E-2, that's for sure. Yeah. So it is a story you've never heard before, that's for sure. And again, it was just kind of one of those things that it's, I said it one other time, is it's easy to make an F-18 or an F-16 or something like that look sexy. They just are by design. It's hard to write a story that makes that thing sexy. And, I think I've accomplished it. That's what people tell me. So, it's an important mission and the personalities that go along with it are vastly different, but alike in a lot of the same ways. So, buddies that have flown, fighters their whole career have read it and they're like, wow, it's no different. I always thought it was different in that squadron, and it's not. It's the same. We're all the same people, just doing different jobs.
Yeah, I'm excited to read it because as you just said it, like what you just described, I'm actually reading one of Jack Carr's books now, right? Which is it's fictional, but there's so much that is real and tied to it, right? Because the authenticity of him. Same with you, but everything you just described there is like those scenarios exist in every squadron, in every organization, and you actually get a guy who has flown it and lived it to write about, which is kind of cool. So I'm excited to read this.
Yeah, it was fun to write. It was an interesting journey, that's for sure. But it was fun. It was cool, and it's good to tell the stories. There's some truth in every fictional book, and, but it is fiction. It's not a story of anything I went through, except for I will say I do put out that the prologue is a true story. Okay, that actually did happen to me. So when people read the prologue, which is actually on the website, you could read the prologue if you just want to get a taste to see if this book's for you. That's actually a true story that happened to me over Iraq, and that was I definitely pulled from my bucket of luck on that one. Yeah. Get that plane back on the deck. So I was very happy to walk away from that one. But yeah, so the rest of it's all.
There you go. Treason Flight. So you guys can pick that up anywhere. Every book. So check that out. We kind of skipped over, but I imagine it might lead to, depending on how this does, you flew the F-18 as well. So I mean, it probably could lead to a series, I would imagine.
Yeah. So book 2 actually is it's being written now. I'm working on it now. So working through it, seeing where this one's going to go. I have a pretty clear path. Different process this time. I'll be the first to say that when I put the first words on paper for that, I didn't really know where the ending was going to go.
Okay.
It kind of built itself. Whereas the second book, I have the whole storyline's in my head now. It's just a matter of getting it on paper and making it a good product is really the big thing. So it's going to happen. Life, obviously, as you know, doing this stuff takes a lot of time. So day job, family, all that, but it is a high priority to do. And I have figured out ways to be able to write at times that I wouldn't write before, to maximize my spare time. So Thank God for technology. So in the cloud, I can keep everything in the cloud now. So it makes it easy to write on multiple platforms. But yeah, so it's coming. It'd be nice to to do this full time, and this would be the job. That's the dream. So, but we'll see what happens. So.
Well, that's awesome.